Yevgenia Kara-Murza. First of all, thank you so much for being with us on Buitenhof and for taking the time. I was wondering, on the 16th of February, we all heard the news that Alexei Navalny died in prison. What did you think on that day?
That it was yet another political assassination. Definitely not the first one. And listen, my husband survived 2 assassination attacks in the past. Alexei himself survived an assassination attack before he was murdered in prison. And in 2015, in February of 2015, Boris Nemtsov was shot down in front of the Kremlin walls.
The opposition
in
leader.
downtown Moscow. Yes, he was my husband's mentor, his colleague, his friend. And he was shot with 5 bullets in the back on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky bridge, about, 100 meters away from the Kremlin walls. And the masterminds and the organizers of this crime have not yet been found. So, this regime has been carrying out political assassinations both in Russia and on foreign soil for many years. This is part of Vladimir Putin's policy of threatening, of spreading fear, spreading this aggression everywhere.
Killing or poisoning your opposition.
Absolutely. Every single person who represents, who could be a competitor to Vladimir Putin is either thrown out of the country, imprisoned, or assassinated, like it happened to Alexei Navalny and Boris Nemtsov. And it takes me to this very important topic of legitimacy of Vladimir Putin. I am here in The Hague on the invitation by Mr. Peter Omtzigt, who wrote a very important report for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on the illegitimate character of the so-called referendum that was carried out in 2020 in Russia, basically destroying the country's constitution and making Vladimir Putin into a czar. The Venice Commission found that this referendum, so-called referendum, had been carried out with all possible violations and could not possibly be accepted as a legitimate process. And thus, Vladimir Putin cannot be accepted as a legitimate leader of the Russian Federation. And there was this resolution by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe calling on all member states to not recognize the legitimacy of Vladimir Putin. The same resolution was recently adopted by the European Parliament, again calling on member states to not recognize the legitimacy of Vladimir Putin, someone who kills, imprisons, or throws out of the country every single opponent, someone who carries out these electoral processes on occupied Ukrainian territories, and someone who completely destroyed the country's constitution. Now, Vladimir Putin has appointed himself President of the Russian Federation for the 5th time in March of this year. And that cannot be accepted by the international community. So I call on the Netherlands to show a good example to the European Union and to those big partners, the US, Canada. I call on the Netherlands to show an example and finally call a spade a spade. Call Vladimir Putin a usurper, a dictator, and do not recognize his legitimacy. The call has been made by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and by the European Parliament. Follow up on that.
Do you think it will happen? Because, as you know, there is a new government in the making in the Netherlands, and the winner of the parliamentary elections here in the Netherlands has been the PVV, and the leader of that party in 2018 visited the Duma, was wearing a Dutch-Russian pin and asking for friendship with Russia.
I would say that asking for friendship, asking a bully for friendship is not a very far-sighted policy. I would say that asking for friendship of someone who carries out aggressive invasions into neighboring countries, neighboring sovereign countries, who carries out wars and aggressive attacks on Russian regions, like it happened, war crimes were committed in Chechnya. Someone who oppresses his own population, that is not a good friend. That is not someone you want to be associated with in a normal, in the 21st century. And I think it is time to bring morals back into politics and to realize that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the war of aggression against Ukraine, is the result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while carrying out very similar crimes to those that are now being committed in Ukraine and in Russia.
In all fairness, Geert Wilders, the leader of the PVV, has distanced himself now from Vladimir Putin and the policies and the war in Ukraine. Still, I would like to hear your take on this. He will form a government. He is the biggest party in the government. He will not be prime minister. And Pieter Omtzigt and the NSC are going to cooperate with him in this government. Is that a bad sign for you?
A bad sign for me is to see that even with a full-scale war of aggression in the middle of Europe, very often economic interests, business interests, go ahead of human rights. It is very sad and disappointing to me to see that, and I want to emphasize yet again that morals need to be brought back into politics.
What specifically
Ethics.
would you like to say to the new Dutch government that is being assembled as we speak?
That human rights violations that are happening in a country cannot be considered an internal affair of that state. Actually, there are legal international documents that state that. The OSCE 1989 and 1991 documents co-signed by Russia that clearly state that human rights violations that are happening in the country cannot be seen as an internal affair of any state, and now the states have the responsibility to get involved and prevent those violations from happening or punish those responsible for those violations. Now, in Russia, the human rights were being violated by this regime for a quarter of a century now. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin was also carrying aggressive attacks against our neighbors, invading Georgia in 2008, annexing Crimea in 2014, bombing a civilian population in Syria, and never ever has he been slapped on the wrist. Never ever has he been made to understand that he would not be able to get away with committing those crimes. And so in his logic, well, if war crimes are permitted in Chechnya, why not in Ukraine? If he can annex Crimea, why not the rest of Ukraine? If he can squash peaceful protests in Russia without being slapped on the wrist, because there's always going to be someone who will sign a business deal with him. That is not allowed anymore. That should not be acceptable anymore, because we need to understand, and that would also be my message to the Dutch government, that there is only one guarantee for peace and stability on this continent, and that is a democracy in Russia. That is a democratic Russia, because for as long as there is going to be some kind of regime surviving in the Kremlin, warmongering will continue, as will repression in the country. And Russia will continue being a threat to everyone around it, and that aggression will spread.
How is your husband doing?
My husband, since last September, since September of 2023, my husband has been held in solitary confinement in a punishment cell that measures roughly 6 square meters, where the bed is attached to the wall from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., where he gets an hour and a half of reading and writing a day, where he is allowed an hour and a half of walk a day in a small courtyard. And for the last 8 months, he has not seen or talked to a single other prisoner because he is kept in complete isolation. But what is important to understand is that...
If I may interrupt, this would drive any sane person mad.
Amazingly, Vladimir keeps his spirits, and amazingly, he finds he's strong enough to send words of support to other people. But what I want to say is that Vladimir's case is atrocious, yes, and his 25-year prison sentence, he still beats the record. in Russia's penitentiary system, as well as with the conditions in which he is serving this sentence. But his case is also very illustrative of the situation with human rights in Russia in general. Because according to OVD Info, an independent media project, Russian independent media project, just from January 1st to May 5th of this year alone, in those few months, 970 people, according to their calculations, have been detained during public events across the country. That means that roughly 8 people per day are being detained for opposing the government policies, for opposing the war in Russia. And that shows an atrocious situation with human rights.
When is the last time you spoke to your husband?
Last summer. Vladimir is not allowed phone calls and is not allowed any visits. And the last time I was allowed to speak to him was last summer, and that was a 10 to 15 minute phone call. Our kids, we have 3 kids, our kids were allowed a phone call with their dad in December, last December. And that was also a 15-minute phone call, divided by 3 kids. Each kid got 5 minutes on the phone with their dad, and I had to stand there with a timer, just making sure that no one got a minute over that 5-minute limit, because I wanted to make sure that all of our kids got to speak to their dad. That was the first phone call in over half a year. And again, this just illustrates the nature of that regime and the fact that this regime will kill anything living. And what Vladimir Putin is doing nowadays in Russia, carrying out this mass repression against Russian civil society, is he's trying to destroy the democratic alternative to himself. And it is very important for the world to send a message of solidarity and support to that part of Russian civil society that continues opposing this regime despite all odds.
Are you not afraid to speak out here on Dutch camera, on many cameras, that your outspokenness will maybe affect the situation of your husband in prison?
First of all, I believe that my outspokenness is needed today. I believe that it is the best way I can help my husband, because I know how much his work means to him. My husband has been in the opposition to Vladimir Putin since Vladimir Putin came to power. And he was one of the driving forces behind the Magnitsky legislation around the world. And we believe that the 2 assassination attacks on him were carried out in retaliation for his involvement in the Magnitsky campaign that called
this
for
act,
the use
way,
of sanctions, personal targeted sanctions against the regime.
Exactly. So many Russians who are close to Putin, made a lot of money, can fall into the sanction regime. You have stated before that you were almost happy that your husband was arrested and that he's still alive, because he has been arrested after he went to the United States when he was still a free man, and then he came back to Russia, and people have asked, why did you go back? Because the risk was very big, and you said, well, at least he was arrested, he's still alive.
Well, I cannot call that happiness. Honestly, that would not be the word that I'd use. It is true that I've been afraid for my husband's life for many years now, since at least 2015, when he ended up in a coma with a multiple organ failure following the first attack on him, the first poisoning. And I remember that it took him over a year to relearn how to walk and use a spoon. So yes, I have been worried for him for many years. But at the same time, I know what he's fighting for. I know exactly what he's fighting for, and I know that for years he has been giving his voice to many people who reject Vladimir Putin's policies. And because it is important to understand that the existence of political prisoners in Russia, for example, is not something new. Even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to very conservative estimates by Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights group, there were over 300 political prisoners in the country. And that was before the full-scale invasion. Now the numbers are skyrocketing. So it's important to understand that political repression has been going on in Russia and was largely neglected, largely ignored by the international community for years.
Yeah. Vladimir Putin seems very strong at this moment. He's gaining territory in Ukraine. His opposition leaders are in jail or dead. And your husband has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. Still, your husband stated shortly after he was sentenced, "I know the day will come when the darkness engulfing our country will clear." Do you still believe that that will happen?
Absolutely. But that belief has to be productive. You know, if we just sit on the couch and hope for something to happen, it's not going to happen. We need to do everything to bring closer the day when it happens. And so it's up to us to change the situation. And you said that yourself that Vladimir Putin seems to be getting stronger to gain territories. Maybe the international community should ask itself why this is happening. Because I believe that the war could have been ended by now had Ukraine received all the support that it has been asking for on time when it was asking for it. So doing too little, too late, not enough is just, this is what is driving the war. This is what makes it longer. This is what prolongs the suffering of the Ukrainian people. This is what allows Vladimir Putin's regime survive sanctions and everything else. Not closing the loopholes, not closing the gaps, not providing enough military support to Ukraine. And also solidarity and support to Russian civil society is just as needed, because if we want to see Russia a democracy one day, and I want to repeat myself that that is the only guarantee of peace and stability on this continent, that part of Russian society needs to feel that it can be part of the international community, that its struggle is recognized and its struggle is respected.
Yevgenia Kara-Murza, thank you so much for being with us, and I wish you all the luck in the world.
Thank you.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet je vooral niet te abonneren, een like of een comment achter te laten. Dat kan natuurlijk ook.
But listen, we are now facing a wave of populism across continental Europe. And what you have to start by doing is understanding where people are coming from.